Welcome back. Since 9/11, there has been an increased emphasis on national security and intelligence gathering in Canada and elsewhere. But how do we balance public safety with civil liberties? What role should the Muslim community play to help establish this balance? We'll answer these questions and more with our returning guest, Zhou. Stephen is a journalist and editor focusing on post-9/11 politics and culture. He's an editor at the Islamic Monthly and a regular op-ed contributor to CBC News Online. Let's get his thoughts on this issue now. Welcome back to the show, Stephen.
Thank you for having me.
So why do you think we're seeing an increased emphasis on national security, specifically here in Canada?
This isn't a particularly recent pattern or phenomenon. Since 9/11 particularly, there has been a buildup or emphasis on surveillance of people within the society, which is kind of a reflection of more totalitarian tendencies we see in other less democratic spaces or societies. And this, of course, is related to state and governments wanting to have more control, to have more information on the people that they preside over. This is a natural tendency of central government. Unfortunately, that often comes in contradiction or into conflict with the civil liberties and the human rights that ought to be inherently protected and endowed to human beings and to citizens within these societies.
So on the ground, how do you think this is impacting community relations?
I think on the ground, people's privacy, which used to be called liberty and freedom, and now we call privacy, which is very interesting, is being encroached upon regardless of what cultural background or religious affiliation you are. And particularly for the Muslims and particularly for activists, for example, who are people who have had an adversarial or as portrayed as being adversarial to the central goals or of a society. They're having their activities monitored. And of course, within the Muslim community, there has been well-documented instances of monitoring, of surveillance within mosque spaces, for instance, or of community spaces. And this is a limiting factor in terms of people's ability to organize and to be together.
So I'm going to ask you a very upfront question. Do you think it's important for Canada to prioritize or focus on, to a certain extent, national security and counterterrorism? Is that something that should be a priority?
The goal of every society, particularly for democratic societies where we value freedom and liberty, is to guarantee security, is to guarantee public safety. Without those things, we don't have a country, we don't have a society. The point is that there's been a confusion or conflation, particularly with regards to our political rhetoric and our language, that confuses and conflates public safety with overreaching surveillance, security-heavy policies by certain governments, and including the Canadian government, that has to do less with public security and public safety and more to do with just knowing what people are doing, just knowing what they're saying, when they're saying it, as a form of social control. A collection of metadata, for instance. Collection of metadata being when you send an email, or it's data about data, and many other things. Now, this kind of thing there is no real, concrete, overwhelming evidence that this kind of bulk collection of people's information leads to a safer public. And I would argue that the kinds of post-9/11 security policies that we have been enacting over and over again, and to larger and more extensive forms, are not necessarily conducive to a safer public, which is based more on trust, particularly between people who enforce the law physically versus communities, particularly minority communities. I mean, that's always been a tension in places like the United States and even in Canada.
So if we know what's happening right now is not the best way forward in terms of collecting data on en masse, then what is the right solution then?
Well, I think there probably should be a recalibration or rethinking about state interest and state policies that are all about collecting people's data or metadata, aka signals intelligence. And if my country or any democratic country is going to be intelligent and collect intelligence, which is important, you want information, relevant information on the people you preside over. That is part of government. Then to do so in a way that is conducive to establishing trust, which means going back to more human relationship oriented kinds of methods that would lead to better intelligence, and I would argue then would lead to a better and safer public.
So you're saying better relationships between the intelligence community and the people on the ground?
Intelligence, law enforcement versus people that who they're interested in, which is these days is Muslims, but of course that's problematic too.
Yeah. So how do you rebuild, I would argue that you need to rebuild that relationship. Let's focus on Muslims for a second. How does the Muslim community begin to trust the intelligence community, given historical wrongs in the past, and there are plenty, for it to go back and do some research?
Well, I think, not to paint the history or the record of Canadian intelligence or policing with a broad brush and to say that it's all been bad or anything like that. But I think that there has been an overarching language and overarching climate in Canada and in the United States that prioritizes Muslim community as being the number one public safety threat, that the people who are most dangerous and are unstoppably dangerous sometimes are products of an ideology called Islam, of a religious/political ideology that has to do with Islam and naturally arises out of Islam. So we need assurances from these communities all the time for them to apologize all the time for things that have happened that are violent, et cetera, et cetera. Moving out of that framework, because that is not terribly reflective of reality. Moving out of that framework and shifting that rhetoric and making it a more accurate, more fair language and rhetoric, particularly in this day and age, would go a long way in terms of reestablishing trust. And we need to see that, particularly, I think, from our more visible politicians.
And how do we acknowledge and address a very good point that you brought up about, changing the language and rhetoric and also making it, because right now the language is very focused on the Muslim, looking at counterterrorism and national security from a Muslim lens. So how do we acknowledge that this is an issue beyond not just focusing on the Muslim lens, but you need to put a lens for all people? How do we begin to have that conversation as well?
Our intelligence agencies, particularly CSIS, along with, I think, the RCMP, and I think many of our local police departments have data and understand for a long time now that right-wing, white nationalist, populist, whatever you want to call it, racism and militarism is a higher, more immediate threat to public safety and to domestic national security than Muslim terrorism. This has been reported into public record for years now, and they understand this. But I think there is something that also has to do with the overall political climate. Sometimes it's not conducive, perhaps, to your department or to your platform or to your political position. If you come out and buck the trend and start saying that actually Muslims, there are problems, but let's put it in proportion. That doesn't get you more money from the government. That doesn't get you more money or more votes from your constituency, which is, perhaps more easily riled up with another kind of rhetoric, which is what we see today.
So how do we, you and me, as citizens of Canada, what can we do as well?
Well, I think, being a Muslim myself and speaking on a platform that reaches a certain number of Muslims, I would start by addressing particularly Muslim youth who, go to school and have access to like-minded people, perhaps, to really establish spaces within their communities in order for them to talk about these things openly and in a way that addresses their core concerns. And I would say that this kind of conversation would have to take place on top of a lot of knowledge. And I would urge, particularly Muslim Canadians, but all Canadians and everybody who's living under today's political climate, to familiarize themselves with what is happening. I mean, most of this stuff, the vast majority of it, has been well reported and is in the public domain and on public record, but is sort of hidden in plain sight. I would urge people to access this information and to then address these issues either with their local politicians or with whoever, but also at the same time to create spaces where this can be talked about and strategies can be formed going forward.
And just as we wrap up, we also have a large non-Muslim audience. So what's your message to the non-Muslim crowd?
We are all living under the same roof. We're all part of the same society here. So I've long advocated, for instance, for Muslims to be part of causes that are not necessarily just affecting, related to the Muslim community. And Muslims have to do that. And I would say the same thing with the non-Muslim crowd. And that is, we have common interests here. And it would be in everybody's interest to tackle these issues broadly.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for such a holistic and fulfilling conversation. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Hey YouTube, we hope you benefited from this video. If you liked it, or if you didn't, let us know in the comments below. And if you're interested in learning more, check out some of our other videos. And don't forget to subscribe so you can get new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.